This is JCT TV. It's Bible study for the 21st century. So friends, we are in Acts, the book of Acts, which is volume 2 of Luke. A lot of people don't know this, but it is a 2-volume work by Luke. The Gospel of Luke, the book of Acts. And that's why in my writing with Cantelon's Casual Commentary, I've written a commentary on Matthew, Mark, Luke, Acts, and John. I did it in that order because that's the order I think it should be done in. Nevertheless, it's the marvelous history that the historian Luke provides us, and we're just starting it. We'll get to it right after this.
Assure you from the inside it is happening. God is our hope. God is all we believe in, this God. And he has called us to be the repairers of wars and to take care of the widow and the orphan in their time of need. And that is exactly what we do. Lives are changing. Why? Because Jesus is Lord. And why? Because Christians have come together as a body. The united body of Christ is coming and saying, it stops with this generation. We break it and we move on.
The kind of religion that God endorses is to care for orphans and widows in their distress, justice, and to keep oneself unpolluted from the world, righteousness.
So last program, friends, we were in Acts chapter 1, and we're there now, of course, and we were reading the account of the ascension of Jesus. Now, as vital as the resurrection is, and I cannot stress adequately how vital it is. Paul puts it well. He said, if Christ isn't risen, then our faith is in vain. So there you go. Christianity is of no value if there is no empty tomb, if there is no resurrection. So it's absolutely vital. But an aspect of this Acts 1 account that is also vital is what we refer to as the ascension. Not just the ascension, but take a look at this. So I read last week about the angels saying, why are you looking into heaven? But then, I'm going to underline this. This same Jesus, okay, who was taken up from you into heaven, will so come in like manner as you have seen him go into heaven. Now, this is a reference to what we know in history. I'll just write up here slowly because this thing doesn't work very well. You maybe have run into this word. Parousia. Greek word referring to the great hope of the church, the return of Christ. Everything from this point throughout the rest of the New Testament is predicated on an expectation that Jesus is coming back and he's coming back soon. There's no reason to discount the firm belief that the disciples, that the Apostle Paul, Peter, the Apostle John, all of them had, that Jesus was coming, if not in their lifetime, very shortly after their lifetime. Again, They had no sense that the return of Christ would be delayed, or that it would take 2,000 years and counting for that event to occur. They were urgently committed to the return of Christ, and so this fired, if you will, their evangelical zeal to get out into the world and preach the gospel. They wanted as many people as possible to hear about the resurrected Christ before he came back for his own. So this promise of him coming back is, you cannot stress its importance in terms of the history of the church. When I'm a preacher's kid, as you know. When I cut my teeth on a church pew, I come from a long line of preachers. My family have been preachers of the gospel since 1913. Can you believe it? But it is true. And then my 3 kids are all in the ministry, and I've got a cousin with his 4 kids in the ministry. So, you know, the beat goes on. But I remember as a little guy, and my dad was pastoring small churches on the prairies of Canada, in Saskatchewan and Alberta. Not just him preaching about it, but occasionally guest speakers would come through, occasionally missionaries would come through. And then occasionally we'd be at, they called them special meetings, where people would gather together regionally for, a day of services and singing and worshiping the Lord. It didn't seem to matter. I mean, I'm a little guy, but it didn't matter if it was Christmas, New Year's, Easter, the dedication of a baby, a funeral, didn't matter. The preacher always brought up, Jesus is coming soon. Jesus is coming soon. The seminary I went to was established right out of the Second World War in central Saskatchewan, and it was built out of second and third hand materials, because why should we spend good money on new building material when we know Jesus is coming back before 1956? They didn't set that date, but that's what they meant. That's how urgent the sense was that Jesus is coming soon. Okay? And I think that we've got to just qualify this coming soon concept. Peter said, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years like a day in God's sight. Very important to keep that in mind. There are economies of scale that are earthly and economies of scale that are heavenly. And for us here on earth, it seems that things, take forever to be accomplished. From heaven's perspective, there's not even one day to the next. For heaven, everything is now. Okay? That's why 1,000 days is like a day, and a day like 1,000. 1,000 years like a day, and a day like 1,000 years. It's 2 totally different contexts. One is space and time, the other is timeless, the other is eternal. Okay? So, with that in mind, if 1,000 years is like a day, then from heaven's perspective, we're only, if you will, 2 days in since Jesus ascended into heaven. You can say, well, that sounds like a kind of a rationalism. I don't see it that way. I really do believe that the last days in which we are living can be seen in those terms. I don't know, neither do you, what the next 1,000 years will bring. It could very well be that the Lord will break into space and time and history today or tomorrow. That's up to him. But I do not get uptight about the delay, as it's often called, in the return of Christ. Again, from heaven's perspective, we're only 2 days in. Okay, enough said about that. I'll just get rid of all this writing here so I'm not distracting you. It's absolutely fascinating to put your mind, or engage your mind with some of this. It's one thing to read the scripture casually. It's another thing to stand back a bit, take a breath or two, and just sort of slowly walk through it, word by word. Okay? So, verse 12. Then they returned to Jerusalem from the mount called Olivet, which is near Jerusalem, a Sabbath day's journey. when we talk about a Sabbath day's journey, as you know, I lived in Jerusalem for 7 years. We planted King of Kings Church there, raised our kids there. They grew up educated in the Hebrew language in local Israeli schools, elementary and high school. My wife speaks Hebrew fluently. I can get along, but our kids they speak Hebrew like they're Israelis. So, Jerusalem really is still, in our family view, our hometown. But in that context, we got to know not just Jerusalem, but we got to know Israel intimately. I used to go up once a week to Lebanon in my little Volkswagen, and I had a military pass, and they'd let me into the war zone of southern Lebanon. And there was a little radio station there called the Voice of Hope that was broadcasting the gospel to southern Lebanon and northern Israel. And they allowed me in for the 7 years that I pastored in Jerusalem. And so I got to know, the Judean wilderness. I got to know the Jordan Valley. I got to know the Sea of Galilee and Tiberias and the Mount of Olives. And I got to know it all just like the back of my hand. I can see it even as I'm talking about it. Well, Luke is going to talk about the disciples now after this ascension, leaving the Mount of Olives and walking a Sabbath day's journey into the city. And if you don't know what a Sabbath day's journey is, and if you maybe can't see the context of the Mount of Olives, the Kidron Valley, and the city of Jerusalem, let me help you with that. Sabbath day's journey was basically 3,000 steps. It was 2,000 cubits. And a cubit was a distance from an adult male from his elbow to the tip of his fingers. That's about a foot and a half for most of us. So 2,000 of these was essentially 3,000 feet. Cubit, 1.5 feet. So Sabbath day's journey means it took about 3,000 steps to get from the Mount of Olives down through the Kidron Valley and up to, as it turns out, what became known as the Upper Room. It's not really far. And if you want to go out on your daily walk, just count out 3,000 steps and you'll see essentially what we're talking about. A little less than a mile maybe, or around a mile, which tells me they were probably coming from Lazarus, Mary, and Martha's house, which was on the southeastern slope of the Mount of Olives. Okay, so enough background to this passage, and we'll continue later.
In Africa, even the most basic medical aid is often non-existent. It is a continent that has been ravaged by disease. Malaria, tuberculosis, HIV, and AIDS are unrelenting. Every man, woman, and child suffers from a lack of adequate health care. Even treatable illnesses like diarrhea and upper respiratory infections can prove deadly. Clinics are too few and often beyond the reach of those in rural areas. WOW, working for Orphans and Widows, is equipping mobile medical clinics with knowledge and tools to reach out to the sick. Trained nurses are treating the ill. Communities are being educated on hygiene and disease prevention. Voluntary counseling and testing for HIV and AIDS is also offered through the clinic. Fear of stigma and discrimination keeps many from being tested for HIV. Nurses address this issue. They work to provide emotional and medical support for those who test positive for the virus. Communities are being transformed through education and medical treatment brought by mobile clinics. Knowledge about disease transmission is changing behaviors and preventing many illnesses. Basic health care prevents needless deaths. Voluntary counseling and testing has also curbed the spread of AIDS.
Many people have learned a lot about HIV/AIDS. Since we are taught, we are trained as community health workers, we have the knowledge, we give it to them, even through role plays and everything, even by talking to them as we go in the villages. So now people are aware what HIV/AIDS is, how it can be prevented, how it can be infected, and all that.
By supporting WOW's Working for Orphans and Widows mobile medical clinics, you can bring hope to countless communities. You can save a life.
So friends, I'm going to take a little break. I promised that next time I would continue with this Ascension story, and of course I will, but that'll be the next program. I want to take a few minutes now and talk to you about Working for Orphans and Widows. You see us promoting it on my program. This is a ministry that my wife and I started 22 years ago in response to what was then known as the HIV and AIDS pandemic. I was pastoring a very significant church on the west coast of Canada, Broadway Church, a very large church, several thousands of people, situated in a very poor part of Vancouver, East Vancouver. And we began to reach out to the impoverished people just a few blocks away from the church. And in the process, I discovered the huge impact of HIV and AIDS, especially among Aboriginal women who essentially were in the sex trade. And I saw the destitution and the horrible impact of HIV and AIDS in their lives. And I began to study it like I'd never done before, or I even hadn't had an interest before. And as I began to study HIV and AIDS, I discovered it was the biggest orphan and widowmaker in the history of mankind. And the Lord really laid it on me. You know, God is a father to the fatherless and a defender of widows. He cares about orphans and widows, really bottom line. Jesus referred to them as the least of these. That's sort of where, if you will, God's love for the world begins, with the least powerful, with the most easily exploited, the most easily pressed down, the most easily sexually abused, young widows and young girls who are fatherless. And so it's a long story, but I was so moved by this kind of impulse from the Holy Spirit that we resigned that church. And for 8 months, Kathy and I lived out of suitcases. We really didn't know where we were going and what we were doing. I just had a sense that we need to get involved in Southern Africa, where the epicenter of the major prevalence rate, about 33% of HIV and AIDS existed. I don't have the time to tell you the whole story, but for the last 22 years, we have been working now with orphans and widows impacted by HIV and AIDS, and in the last 2 years now with COVID-19 on top of it, kind of a double exposure to pandemic and pandemic. What I felt we should do was start with local churches. I felt then, I feel now, the local church was God's hand extended to the world. I didn't think that there was a need for some white guy to come in and change the world for these orphans and widows. What I thought needed to happen was for the churches and the volunteers from those churches to be making the difference. Unfortunately, because of the stigma attached to HIV and AIDS, most churches were ignoring people who are HIV positive. It was really not a happy thing from my perspective. But I come in there as a pastor, and I began to connect with churches that I'd connected with when I used to come down and do conferences from Jerusalem. They used to refer to me as a bishop from Jerusalem. I wasn't a bishop from Jerusalem, but that's how they saw me. So I had kind of traction, if you will, credibility with them. Plus I was older than them, and I got white hair and no hair. I'm big. Anyhow, the upshot of it is that we began to develop ministries. I call them champion ministries in various sub-Saharan African countries. And some we were able to work ourselves out of a job, some were still there. And right now, currently, we're working in South Africa, in Malawi, in Zambia, and as of the last couple of years, also in Chennai, South India. All focusing on orphans and widows, all working with volunteers from local churches. And these precious orphans and widows are being cared for in terms of what we call home-based care. If they're ill, we're providing them care. If they're hungry, we're providing them food. If they're naked, we're providing them clothing, but in their own little humble mud rondavels, as they're called, their own little mud huts. And so over the course of these 22 years, without any reliance on governmental funding or deep pockets, I don't have deep pockets, you don't either probably, but through the faithfulness of people that trust me and I trust them. And, when you're on television, as long as I've been now, I'm in my 4th decade of television, you get to know people and they get to know you. Anyhow, with the faithful support of people like you, we began to build a ministry to orphans and widows in sub-Saharan Africa and southern India. I've been asked about this home-based care. What does that comprise? And it's very humble, friends. It's not a big splash. I can't come in, like some of the major foundations that have billions of dollars and change the world, or at least think we're changing the world. We come in on the grassroots level and work really on the ground, if you will, on our knees, getting very dusty with local pastors, local volunteers in those churches. And most of the volunteers we work with are widows themselves. What do? They go into these rondavels twice a week. There'll be a little widow, too weak to lift her head. She's maybe 35 years of age. She looks like she's 75 years of age. Skin and bone, skin lesions, oral thrush, dysentery, bed sores. And bed sores, not from lying on a bed, but usually it's a blanket right on the dirt. 2 or 3 little kids looking stricken. And these volunteers go in and they care for that woman. They bathe her, modestly, and it's always woman to woman. They anoint her sores. They do something about the oral thrush. They deal with, what happens when someone has constant diarrhea. They clean everything up and they make sure the kids are fed. And then that home becomes a part of the volunteers' circuit, if you will. And twice a week, going in, monitoring the situation, making reports, but making sure that they've got cooking oil, that they have ground cornmeal called nchima, that they have some salt, and that they have some topical medicines, that they have what they call Panado, we call it aspirin, and a few other over-the-counter medications. And we provide them with 1 or 2 mineral supplements that increase, helps with the immune system. All this is done in conjunction with the local health authorities, so nothing is offside. And the most important thing that our volunteers do is they pray with these people. And I can tell you, I don't know how many thousands and thousands we've dealt with over 22 years. Not one has died without Jesus. Everyone has gone into the presence of the Lord, having committed their lives to Christ. Awesome. And so when I say that Jim Cantelon today, JCT TV, is the voice of wow, that's what I mean. We're presenting the gospel to you and trying to do it in a reasoned, hopefully at least semi-educated way with 52 years of pastoral experience behind me. But it's not just a case of proclaiming the gospel, it's also the case of living the gospel. Righteousness and justice. Now, I want to show you a picture here. I could show you thousands, but this one is very interesting. And what's happening here is you see this little widow, and she's obviously praying. And to her right is the leader of our champion ministry in central Zambia. His name is Eric Mwambelo. He's a pastor. We have just brought her some cornmeal, some cooking oil, some salt, some soap, and a few medications. Now you just see a bit of that there. In this case, it's a fairly large sack, as you can tell, which she is going to help distribute among some of the other widows who were not strong enough to come to this depot. If we can, we have them come to us instead of us going to them. It just simply makes more sense in terms of manpower. But notice the humility and the gratitude to God. Friends, and while I'm going to shift over to this camera. While I do that, I'm going to get another picture, Mr. Director. We're doing this because of, look at this. Look at this guy right here. His home, he's blessed because he has a cement block home that's covered with some kind of plaster. You see it there. His parents were a little better off than other kids' parents were. But what's happened is both his father and his mother have died of HIV and AIDS. And so in his case, he is one of 4, and we call them child-headed households, children raising themselves. And so our volunteers are making sure he is cared for. And we have a local widow who looks in on him every day and every night. And wow is what makes a difference.
Samira mala anadiri baina nyumba ya Khalifa muye anika nyumba ya
sana nati kwa mrefu kumlupia karibu sana I'm not here.
So friends, thanks for indulging me as I talk about working for Orphans and Widows. And I could show you literally thousands of pics. I'll show you more in future programs. But if you would like to find out more about WOW Mission, just log on to wowmission.com, WOWMISSION.com, wowmission.com. And that's our website, and it will give you good background. JimCantelonToday.com is also another place you can go to, which gives you background on this program, but it also gives you a link to WOW Mission, and WOW Mission gives you a link to JCT. So either way you win. But friends, your support, I mean, you want to have a significant impact in our world. There's a lot of ministries out there, and they're all great. But if you want to focus in on this little one here, it's a good one. It's got a proven track record, and I'm accountable to you for these precious souls, these least of these, as Jesus called them. They're being cared for on a daily basis. Thanks for watching. See you next time.